In the 12th century BCE, about 100 years after Ramesses II took power, a series of crises hit the eastern Mediterranean: food shortages, geological disruptions, and mass migrations. From the Egyptian records, we hear about attacks coming from the Mediterranean and the Near East. These attacks were caused by a variety of tribes, whom the pharaohs grouped together under an umbrella term. They called them the Na Chasut En Payim, the foreign peoples of the sea. Today, historians describe these groups as the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples are one of the most prominent and mysterious aspects of the Late Bronze Age collapse, a historical catastrophe in which numerous cultures fell to disruption and calamity. And yet, despite their prominence in that later phase, the Sea Peoples were not a new phenomenon. In fact, by the time those crises occurred, these groups had been known in the historical record for almost 200 years. References to the individual tribes who formed the Sea Peoples appear in multiple communities across this region, including Egypt. And early in his reign, Ramesses II had his own experience with these outsiders. This tale begins late in 1291 BCE. It is now regnal year 2 under the power of Ramesses II, or Usir-Ma'at-Ra, Ramesses II. The king's first regnal year had been busy, with various business, building projects, and religious festivals to attend to. Those first few months are remarkably well documented, and we can track many of the king's movements during his first year in power. The next major event comes in the second year of his rule. In that year, Ramesses commissioned a stela. The stela is in Aswan, in the far south of the country. It's a rhetorical stela that describes the king's power and victories over all foreign lands. It's a fairly typical stela that says things like, quote, Year 2, the 3rd month of Shemu, day 26, under the power of Ramesses, the one who is Montu of millions, powerful like the son of Nut, that is Sutech or Seth, who fights upon the battlefield, a bold-hearted lion, when he has attacked multitudes in the space of a moment. Egypt rejoices at the ruler that is within her, for he has enlarged her boundaries forever. Destroyed are the Easterners, fallen are the Libyans. He has trampled the foreign countries, and those of the north say, "Oh, that we had the breath of life." End quote. Fairly typical stuff, beating his chest, proclaiming his victories. You get the idea. But within this stela, Ramesses does make an interesting reference. Among his various foes, Ramesses mentions a group that we've not heard about previously. He calls them the Achau Nu Wajwer, that is, the warriors of the Great Green. The Great Green is the Egyptian term for the sea, usually the Mediterranean, which suggests that Ramesses or his people were having issue with raiders or pirates coming from distant lands. The reference goes as follows, quote, I, Ramesses, cause Egypt to go on military expeditions. The people sit in the shade of Ramesses' strong arm, and they fear no foreign country. The king has destroyed the warriors of the Great Green. The Nile Delta slumbers and can sleep. He is an effective king, reliable in his plans. Nothing that he has said will ever be overturned. The foreigners come to him with their children, begging for the breath of life. His war cry is powerful. End quote. This reference is interesting. Ramesses specifically says the Nile Delta can sleep or rest, suggesting that these warriors of the Great Green had been troubling the Mediterranean coast and the river outlets of the Nile. We don't often think about Egypt's northern coast because that area is largely marsh and farmland. not a huge number of settlements are recorded during the New Kingdom period. But presumably there were villages, either communities of traders, fisherfolk, or people who managed farms and estates in the vast delta region. This area would be particularly vulnerable to anybody coming from the sea. Apparently, the Egyptians were having trouble with security. This is Ramesses' first reference to the problem, but it would not be his last. In a stela excavated at the city of Tanis in the far north of the country, Ramesses mentions a conflict against a tribal group. This group are called the Sherdeniu, or the Sherden. This is particularly interesting because the Sherden are one of those sea peoples who appear about 100 years later during the late Bronze Age collapse, and the pharaohs who fought against the sea peoples included descriptions and art of the Sherden in their monumental inscriptions. Ramesses II has his own dealings with this tribe. The text goes as follows, quote, Ramesses' might has crossed the Great Green. The islands in the midst are in fear of him. The foreigners come to the king, carrying the gifts or tribute of their rulers. The Sherden of rebellious hearts, those whom none could ever fight against, they came bold-hearted, in fighting ships from the midst of the Great Green. They are those whom none could withstand. But he, Ramesses, plundered them by the victories of his victorious arm, and they were carried off to Kemet, or Egypt. End quote. Ramesses explicitly describes a conflict with the Sherden. He says that they came from the midst of the Great Green, that is, across the sea, and they specifically came from the islands which are in the midst. That phrase, islands in the midst, is usually interpreted as a reference to the Aegean with its countless islands between Greece and Anatolia. Apparently, these Sherden warriors had come from that region, and they came in a new type of vessel, which the Egyptians invented a word to describe. Ramesses specifically describes the Sherden transports as fighting ships, a phrase that hasn't survived in the historical record until now. The Egyptians were familiar with fighting on the Nile. They had done it previously during times of crisis or civil war. But despite that long cultural experience, they didn't have any word that would specifically translate as fighting ship. Apparently, there was something distinctive about the Sherden vessels which encouraged them to use this term. We might get a clue to that from one of Ramesses' successors, a king who came about 100 years later and had his own encounters with the Sherden. That later ruler was named Ramesses III, and in monumental art on one of his temples, he showed images of the Sherden sailing in their ships in order to attack Egypt. In those images, the Sherden vessels are distinctive. They are quite long, with a mast and sail amidships, and they have prominent decorated prows and sterns that look like duck or bird heads. They also have a curious feature: large boxes or rectangles at the prow and stern, kind of like the castles on a medieval galley. In other words, the Sherden vessels might be fortified or armoured in some way, suggesting that they were specifically designed for combat rather than the transport ships, which were the standard Egyptian style. Unfortunately, Ramesses II does not describe these fighting ships in any great detail, so we have to rely on the art from 100 years later to speculate. But it's possible that the Sherden were a kind of specialized raider or pirate group who had fortified vessels that they used for the purpose. Further supporting that idea are references from letters written about 60 years before Ramesses II. In the mid-1300s BCE, in the time of kings like Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, we have letters from foreign rulers that mention these Sherden. In one example, the ruler of Byblos, a city on the coast of modern-day Lebanon, references Sherden as a local threat in his community. The ruler says, quote, A man with a bronze dagger attacked me, but I killed him. A Shertanu, or Sherden, whom I know, got away back to my enemy. At his order was this attempted assassination done." End quote. So apparently the ruler of Byblos was having trouble with a Sherden warrior, whom he knew, trying to assassinate him. Around the same time, the rulers of Ugarit, which is on the coast of modern Syria, also made references to the Sherden, or Sheridani, as a tribal group present in their community. Apparently, these Sherden were visible and known across the eastern Mediterranean, a good century and a half before the famous Bronze Age collapse. Along with their vessels, we should also talk about their weapons. The Sherden warriors, just by themselves, do appear in the art of Ramesses II, and the Egyptians consistently draw them with distinctive armor and weaponry. In Ramesses' art, the Sherden always carry a large circular shield. This might be wood or perhaps even bronze. They also wear armor that seems to be a kind of layered or segmented leather, or again, possibly metal. They carry spears, fairly typical for the time, and they also carry a distinctive sword. Instead of the Egyptian-style sword, which is the curved, sickle-shaped khopesh, the Sherden warriors always appear with a straight blade. The swords are depicted as a long, tapering triangle, usually with a line or ridge running down the center of the blade. Scholars suggest that these swords might be similar to the types known as Achaean Type B or Naue II, which is a design of sword quite common in the Mediterranean and Europe during the Bronze Age periods. On average, the swords appear to be about 60 to 70 centimeters long, or 24 to 28 inches. A decent length. We're not talking giant two-handers or anything, but if you're on the wrong end of this particular blade, they will ruin your day. Based on archaeological finds of similar swords, they are probably bronze, with leather or wood forming the handle. So the Sherden were carrying a distinctive set of equipment in order to fight their battles. That distinctiveness is particularly true for their helmets. Probably the most unique feature of the Sherden imagery is the headgear that they wear into battle. It looks like an upturned bowl on top of the head, with a metal disc like a sun disk emerging from the top. Then, to either side of the helmet, the Sherden have spiky protrusions. That is, they wear horns. If you're a fan of history, and I assume you are, you're probably familiar with the stereotype of Norse or Viking warriors having prominent horns on their headgear. That particular image is a historical fiction invented during the 19th century. The actual Norsemen did not use such embellishments. The Sherden, though, do actually have horns on their helmets, which in a roundabout way makes them more Viking than the actual Vikings. It's a weird little quirk of their design, not a common one in the ancient world, but the Sherden warriors always have horns. Unfortunately, we do not have any physical examples of the Sherden helmets, at least none that have been excavated in Egypt or specifically connected with this community. So we still don't know for sure what these horns were made of, whether they were metal or actual animal tusks attached to the headgear. For now, we can only speculate. But the motif of the horned helmet is so distinctive and so ubiquitous among the Sherden imagery that we have to assume there is some basis in fact. With that in mind, you can imagine these warriors might have been quite terrifying in battle. In the chaos and confusion, a bunch of heavily armed and armored warriors with spiky horned heads might have seemed like monsters, which would certainly help explain the next part of the story. In the decades prior to Ramesses II, references to the Sherden and other sea peoples are largely negative. They are antagonists in the historical texts. Initially, Ramesses faced the same problem, but he seemed to acknowledge that they were skillful warriors. In the text I quoted earlier, Ramesses called the Sherden, quote, "those of rebellious hearts whom none could ever fight against, and he also said they were those whom none could withstand. Now, on the one hand, this is a rhetorical flourish, showing how great Ramesses is for defeating the Sherden. They had been victorious against all enemies until they fought the pharaoh. So obviously there is some exaggeration there. On the other hand, Ramesses definitely appreciated their skill or effectiveness as warriors. And we know that because following his victory, Ramesses actually recruited them. A few years after the battle against the Sherden, Ramesses was marching north into Syria on another military campaign. In his texts describing that effort, the king mentions the soldiers accompanying him to battle. In his description, Ramesses actually says that the Sherden were now part of his army. The king said, quote, "His person gave supplies to his infantry and his chariots, and to the Sherden warriors that he had captured when he took them by the victory of his strong arm. They were furnished with all of their weapons." End quote. In other words, Ramesses had recruited the Sherden after defeating them, and now they marched alongside his troops. We also see this in art. The Sherden warriors appear on the walls of Ramesses' temples, most notably the Great Hall at Abu Simbel on the northern side to your right as you enter, and at the temple in Abydos that Ramesses constructed. The Sherden march in long lines, armed with their distinctive shields, swords, and helmets with their horns. They also engage in battle. In some scenes, they are charging against the foe, stabbing them and cutting their hands off to prove their victory. Notably, the Sherden usually appear in the presence of Ramesses himself. They march underneath images of the pharaoh, separate from the Egyptian troops and chariots. And some scholars have interpreted this to mean that Ramesses might have used the Sherden as part of his royal bodyguard. This is purely educated speculation. None of the texts describe the Sherden as a bodyguard, for which the Egyptian word is shemsu, meaning follower or entourage, or neferu, meaning beauties or recruits. The Sherden don't have any hieroglyph captions, so we don't know how exactly Ramesses related to them. But visually, in the art, they usually accompany the king, suggesting that he kept the Sherden around as a separate, distinctive guard. Why would the king do that? Again, we can only speculate, but it is possible that Ramesses felt these outsiders would be more dependent on him for their livelihoods, and thus more loyal to his whims and needs. Alternatively, he may have found their way of war, their weaponry or equipment, more effective or more impressive, in a way that he wanted to have around when making a public display. Finally, he may simply have enjoyed the exoticism, having a group of foreigners from distant, unknown islands around as his protectors. One of these reasons, or something else entirely, might explain the king's choice. But based on the art from Abu Simbel or Abydos, it does appear as though Ramesses wanted to keep the Sherden close. Perhaps he simply liked them. Through all of this, you may have been wondering, where do the Sherden come from exactly? Ramesses II does not tell us a specific origin for this group. He says that they had come to Egypt from the islands in the midst, which is usually interpreted to mean the Aegean. Because of their prominence as one of the sea peoples, the Sherden and the other groups have received a great deal of attention from scholars, trying to untangle their origins, their motives, and where they ultimately went. Obviously, we'll be covering this topic in much greater detail when we actually reach the late Bronze Age collapse. But since the Sherden are turning up now, it's worth discussing some of the prominent ideas. If we go purely by the name, which Ramesses writes as Sherdeniu, this tribe might come from the island of Sardis in western Anatolia, or they might be a group known as the Sardonians from the Ionian coast. Or they might even be equivalent with the people of Sardinia, the great island west of Italy. All three of those locations are possible candidates for the Sherden's origin point. An Eastern Mediterranean origin does seem quite likely, because, as I mentioned earlier, most of the early references to these people come from northern Egypt or the communities of the Eastern Mediterranean, especially along the coast. That suggests that the Sherden were coming to these centers from the sea, just as Ramesses said, and they might have been arriving in small groups, settling in the region for several decades or centuries prior. The archaeology is pretty slim. We can't identify the Sherden as a distinctive group settling in a specific region. Once again, that's a story for the future as we explore the larger Sea Peoples migrations in about, 100 years after Ramesses II. For now, we have to rely on the account of this particular king, who says they came from the islands in the midst of the sea. That broadly matches up with the earlier references from the coasts of Canaan and Syria, and it gives us an introduction to the Sherden as a people, one that would play a massive role in future Egyptian history. For now, the Sherden had come to Egypt. They had fought battles on the northern coastline, and they had been, officially, defeated. Subsequently, the pharaoh had recognized their value and recruited the Sherden as members of his army. They may have guarded the king personally and been a part of his royal display. It's an interesting feature of Ramesses' early reign, and a mark of the increasing internationalism of northern Egypt and pharaonic society. A feature that is going to become stronger as our story continues. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Before I go, I would like to extend my thanks to my supporters on patreon.com, who keep the show running and allow me to support myself with essentials like research material and coffee, and minor necessities like rent. Special thanks must go to the priests, my top-tier subscribers, who are most generous with their money, and I am in their debt. My thanks to Veronica, Linda, Eric, James, Jeffrey, Terry, Jean, TJ, Karen, Yola, Cien, Mycost, Dan, Andy and Chelsea, James, Nidin, Chris, and Ashley. Folks, you are all too kind, and I am eternally grateful. To everyone listening, thank you for joining me. May the great gods of Egypt, Canaan, Syria, Anatolia, and the islands in the midst of the sea protect you and your loved ones and provide you with a fabulous bodyguard. I'll see you soon.